Hello, and welcome to the Days of Yore. Today, we'll be speaking about Captain George Pottinger, who captained two ships built on Beaubears Island, the Equator and the Ocean Bride. So we'll begin today, as I always do, by mentioning that I'm not an expert, and I'm really giving this information to you more for narrative purposes than anything else. And my sources today come largely from the British newspaper archives. And so let's begin. George Pottinger was a Shetland fisherman, so a gentleman who grew up in the Shetland Islands and eventually got involved in the merchant marine. And he was a very skilled man indeed, and rose very quickly through the merchant ranks. At the age of 22, he was made a first mate on board a ship and had attained his captain's license by the age of 24. So again, that's remarkable for that time. Again, to be a captain at 24, but he was very skilled at what he did. He was a member of the Royal Geographical Society and would eventually intersect his history with Beaubears Island in about 1861. So, to backtrack 10 years, in 1851, and John Harley and George Burchell completed their first ship on Beaubears Island, the Equator. Now, this ship was built on credit, and the sale of this ship was actually used to finalize the sale of Beaubears Island to Harley and Burchell from Joseph Russell. So Harley and Burchell had borrowed money in order to buy Beaubears Island, and with the sale of the Equator, they were able to clear most of their debts. Now, as time and circumstance would have it, George Pottinger became the captain of the Equator in about 1861. So that probably would have been a pretty mundane affair, except for he became the captain of the Equator at a time of great international intrigue, most notably because of the brewing conflict in the United States. So, in 1861, Captain Pottinger was in the port of Pensacola, Florida. And it was right around this time that Florida had decided to leave the United States and join the Southern States Confederacy in what was going to become the American Civil War. So as a result of Florida seceding from the Union, and the United States Federal Navy had blockaded the port of Pensacola. Now, of course, in open revolt against the Union. Now, Captain George Pottinger was really just sort of transporting supplies. He felt he could not be blamed for being caught behind enemy lines, unaware, or in the midst of a civil war in the United States. But not wishing to remain kind of really held and stuck in the port of Pensacola, he decided to run the Federal Navy blockade. Now, this was no small blockade. As a matter of fact, it involved no less than 4 square-rigged naval vessels and 2 steam-powered vessels as well. So again, I mean, this is a considerable blockading force at this time against one ship that was at this time already 10 years old. So Captain Pottinger, again, not one to shy away from taking chances, decided to run the blockade, and he did. But he made, I guess, one very shrewd maneuver. He flew the Union Jack, the British flag, over the ship as it was going out as a sign of neutrality, to say this is a British vessel. This is, they have no stake in this civil conflict. And of course, there's the Federal Navy, not wanting to antagonize these European powers in the midst of a civil war, which would perhaps mean that those European powers would side with the Confederacy. He decided to let Captain Pottinger go. And again, this was quite a feat and quite a personal victory for Captain Pottinger. Interestingly, however, the turnover on the equator after this event was said to have been quite high. And quite a few of the sailors on board the equator, well, decided that they would crew up elsewhere and kind of leave Captain Pottinger with it for a time. So perhaps the excitement of running a blockade in the midst of the Civil War was a bit too much for them, who can say. Not long afterward, Captain Pottinger was promoted to captain, or was moved as a captain to the Ocean Bride. Now, the Ocean Bride was built in 1856 here on Beaubears Island. It was probably the pride of the Harley and Burchell line. It contained no less than 300 pounds sterling worth of oak, and was praised in the newspaper at the time, saying its lines would bear up even under the most discriminating eye, and its strength was well suited for ocean travel. Despite the fact that this was arguably the finest ship that Harley and Burchell ever produced, it cost them dearly. Their profits were razor thin. Though they had spent a great deal in the ship, they could barely recover the cost at the time. In fact, the Ocean Bride and the struggle of trying to sell it convinced George Burchell that perhaps it was best to move on, and that this unforgiving business was not for him. It convinced John Harley that prejudice clearly existed in Great Britain and against builders here in New Brunswick and in other parts of what would become Canada. So all of that aside, it was a fine craft, and Captain Pottinger did push it to its limits. So one of his early trips took a mere 20 days. He's traveling from Great Britain to Quebec with cargo. Another notable trip occurred in 1862, traveling from Newfoundland to Falmouth in England through a terrible storm. He pushed the ship through this storm, bringing it into Falmouth in record time, but again under jury-rigged masts, its sails shredded, again in pretty rough shape. And Captain Pottinger was known for being something of a disciplinarian. He was able to achieve these very quick speeds by being, pretty demanding of his crew. His ship's logs surviving from a number of his voyages stated that a lot of his sailors were disciplined for even the slightest offense. But of course, at the time, the business interests in Great Britain were more than happy with the kind of results that Pottinger was getting. And on this voyage, after this harrowing journey, bringing in the ship waterlogged with jury-rigged sails, as I say, he was rewarded with 100 guineas and a gold watch. So again, they thought pretty highly of him. 3 years later, unfortunately, in 1865, while traveling to Spain, Captain Pottinger was washed overboard and drowned at the age of only 32. So a very young man, his life cut short by a seafaring accident. Unless, there are rumors, some genealogists and others, again, these are not substantiated, but there are some that believe that perhaps Captain Pottinger, having been very demanding of his crew and having taken maybe a few too many risks, raised the ire of his crew on this voyage to Spain, and that perhaps he had a little help falling overboard. I don't really know if that's true or not, but again, it was, we do know that again he was a very demanding man, and perhaps something untoward occurred. Who can say? The Ocean Bride, for its part, was continued in service in 1887 when it struck the steamer Beryl in the Thames in London. perhaps adding a little bit of interesting flavor to the story of Captain Pottinger and the end of Captain Pottinger. Henry Milvain and Sons, who were his employers at the time, did offer a bounty of £10 sterling to anyone who could find his body, perhaps to silence certain of the rumors that I referred to before. And so I guess we'll leave it there for now. George Pottinger, a great sea captain in his way, but perhaps one that pushed things a bit too far. Captaining two premier vessels of the Harley and Burchell line produced on Beaubears Island, and adding some very interesting flavor to the history of both of those ships. Well, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Of course, I'm sure my colleague Ken Walker will be more than happy to see you next week with a new edition of The Living Island. And I will remind you that if you're enjoying these videos, do please consider giving them a thumbs up, subscribing to this channel, and if you're able, please consider visiting our Patreon page in the description below and seeing what options for sponsorship are there. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you, as my colleague Ken very often does, when you're able, if you're able, please come and visit us here on Beaubears Island when the season starts in mid-May. So for now, as I say, we'll leave it there. I'll be talking to you in a couple of weeks. And for the Days of Yore, I've been Dr. Sean McCarthy. Thanks so much.